Hi, I'm Steve Logan. I'm a songwriter and rock musician from South Wales. I'm going to talk today about the Gear Delusion. Let me start by saying that gear is fascinating in the guitar world. The more you know about it, as in any field, the more interesting it gets and the more the small differences count. Like anyone who's likely to be watching this video, I've spent a lot of time studying the specs of guitars, amps and pedals, and this, as well as being entertaining, is also very instructive and helps you to understand a lot more about what's involved in making music. My intention isn't to harp on the familiar theme of GAS, gear acquisition syndrome, being a distraction from playing. It definitely can be, but there are guitarists on YouTube who experiment a lot with different bits of equipment, and some of them, such as John Cordy or Chris Buck, are very accomplished players who clearly have practiced a lot, as well as researched guitars on reverb. Still, they've got their favourite instruments, and you can recognise what those are. There are other players who are much less interested in experimenting, may not have the money to experiment with a lot of different kinds of gear, and they tend to settle quickly on a basic rig, which they gradually refine. But they don't completely revolutionise this very often. When it comes to older players, Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page, Gilmour, Pete Green, Jeff Beck, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, they tend to have a signature rig, in part because there was a lot less gear available when they were young and learning how to play. And then there are players who are a generation younger, Johnny Marr, Jay Mascis, James Dean Bradfield, who experiment but have a sort of ground control rig. Some players younger still, like Matteo Mancuso, even advise against getting obsessed with gear and say that we should learn how to use the equipment we've already got. But what I really want to discuss is the oddity of the situation that guitarists are in right now. First, allow me a brief diversion. When I was a kid, I loved fishing. Whenever I got any money, I'd go to the tackle shop and see what I could buy. What drove me was mostly the excitement of finding out what different bits of tackle could do. Lines with different breaking strains, reels with different winding ratios, rods with different lengths and degrees of flexibility, and so on. But mostly I was just interested in fishing, the whole romance of it. A point came in the tackle shop where I got pretty well known, and an older salesman said to me, "Some tackle catches more anglers than fish." I had enough gear by then to manage, and because I didn't have much money, I never really got obsessed with improving on it. The same principle applies for most people to cars because of their cost. There are very rich car obsessives who have multiple cars, but for most people, one at a time is enough, and once a decision's been made, they tend to stick to it until either the contract runs out or the engine fails. And finally, a similar principle applies in recording. There are many digital audio workstations, DAWs, but there are just two which are industry standard, Pro Tools and Logic. Most engineers won't go far beyond those two and will learn to use them well. Guitar gear is different because over time it's become cheaper, more abundant, and in many respects better. Advertising has also become more ubiquitous and more sophisticated. Let's look at how this situation came about. The first Fender amps were made in 1945. These were followed by the Princeton in 1948 and the Deluxe, Princeton in 1946 and the Deluxe in 1948. Each amp was designed to improve on features of its predecessors. But of course, some people preferred the sound and features of earlier models as the list expanded to include the Deluxe Reverb, 1963, the Twin Reverb, 1952, and the Super Reverb, 1963. When all these amps were available, people would either just get one, and that would be the one that they stuck with because they didn't have an opportunity to try the others, or if they did have the opportunity, they'd try them as and when. Meanwhile, as is common knowledge, Fender invented the Telecaster in 1950, the Stratocaster in 1952, the Jazzmaster in 1958, and the Jaguar in 1962. The first Les Paul came out the same year as the Strat, 1952. Gibson had by then a long history of producing archtop hollow-body jazz guitars. Each of these guitars, and this is the main thing, was intended in some way to refine upon its predecessors. So, for example, the tailpiece of the first Les Paul would be replaced by a stop bar and a tunematic bridge. But as with amps, guitarists came to feel preferences within the range once there was more than one choice. Practical innovation, however, came first, and the personal preferences of guitarists came second. Vox began making amps in 1956, but their first really successful product was the AC-15, 1959. The firm was under pressure to produce an even louder amp because Fender had the Twin, well known for its loudness. The band that asked for this was The Shadows. That was Cliff Richards's band. The reason they needed louder amps was that PAs at the time were underpowered and could barely handle vocals. I need to talk a little bit about live sound here. As in many present-day pub gigs, the guitar and bass had to be projected from the back line, that's to say, from a line of amps behind the guitars, bass and singer, but often roughly level with the drums. For gigs in clubs and small theatres these days, this system is an anachronism. Amps, if they're used at all, will be mic'd up and fed through the PA system, now super powerful, and the whole lot will be controlled by an engineer. The onstage volume will typically be much lower, except for guitarists like, say, Joe Bonamassa, playing on big stages with baffle screens to protect them from a noise level their predecessors would simply have had to put up with. They might want this noise level because of a sound that Leo Fender and Les Paul wanted to avoid, namely breakup or distortion, the sound that happens when the valves in the amp are pushed very hard and the speaker begins to cause the sound to disintegrate slightly. That sound, once something to be avoided, is now coveted by most guitarists to varying degrees. That's another unforeseen consequence of the original pioneers. Marshall came into amp manufacture last of the big three in 1962. Like Vox, they hoped to steal part of the expensive Fender market. The JTM 45 came out in 1963. Soon there was a requirement for still louder amps. More volume was required by, for instance, Pete Townsend of The Who. So the 100-watt Super Lead was invented. Another requirement at that time was for the breakup of the clean tone to start at lower volumes. And This is a characteristic Marshall became known for, usually on dual channel amps. It was still the case, though, that most guitarists, or many at any rate, were plugging directly into their amps and performing, and if they were performing live, they'd be playing them at considerable volume. You can get a sense of what this is like if you watch the videos of Paul Kossoff performing at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. No pedals, but enough volume to reach right through his body and well into the massive 600,000 strong crowd. So the tone of your rig at this time was determined by your amp and relevant features of your guitar, chiefly its wood, whether it was hollow or not, by the pickups, and by the potentiometers. If you wanted to get the tone of a particular guitarist, you might need to have a particular amp and a particular guitar, as well as knowledge and skill, of course. The earliest variation to a basic clean tone introduced on Fender amps was reverb. The amp itself would let you adjust the EQ, and as Neil Young has demonstrated, this alone can produce huge variations of tone. But reverb was something else you could add on top. From this it followed that the basic tone might be made more interesting by varying it in some way not intrinsic to the amp. Diamond had already in 1946 released the tremolo control. There were reel-to-reel devices for getting so-called tape delay. But the first commercially successful standalone effects pedal is widely considered to be the same company's Maestro Fuzz Tone of 1962. That enabled you to get considerable degrees of breakup or distorted tones at any volume. The fuzz tone surged in popularity because Keith Richards used it on Satisfaction in 1965. From these beginnings came the modern pedal industry, which has a whole galaxy of variants and clones of all the principal effects: tremolo, distortion, fuzz, delay, reverb, chorus, phaser, flanger, compressor, booster, and wah. Now, the point I want to focus on is this. If you were Paul Kossoff or Pete Townsend standing in front of a cranked Marshall on a big festival stage, and somebody swapped your amp for a Princeton, a deluxe reverb, or a twin, you'd instantly feel and hear the difference. What's more, the audience would probably hear it too. But if someone playing through a lot of effects pedals, with, for instance, a mild distortion pedal, a Tube Screamer or an OD1, say, constantly on, if someone with that rig swapped the clean channel of a Marshall Plexi for the clean channel of a Fender Twin, I suspect this change, though it could still be felt and heard on stage, would be much milder and to the audience probably undetectable. And now the whole debate about amps versus amp sims is only happening because digital simulations of tube amps have become increasingly good, though you still need a neutral cab and speaker if you want to feel the amp behind you. As Nashville session guitarists like Tom Bukovac and Justin Ostrander sometimes point out, the tonal characteristics of guitars can only really be heard if you get used to playing them through a particular amp. If you run a Strat or a Tele or a Les Paul straight into a deluxe reverb with a certain EQ and use no pedals, the differences between the guitars will be audible, and of course the guitars will feel different in your hands. To get these guitars to produce more different tones, you have to use, as well as the EQ on the amp, the tone controls on your guitar. That's why Leo Fender came up with different types and combinations of controls. The original three-way switch on a Tele or Strat, the rhythm and lead circuits on a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar. Joe Bonamassa has often demonstrated that the tone controls on a guitar tend by many, perhaps even most guitarists, to be underused. Between these and the EQ controls on your amp, there's already a pretty inexhaustible variety of tones available. If you now add in pedals, this situation becomes massively more complex. For example, Johnny Marr now uses a signature Jaguar into a Fender Deluxe reverb, switching sometimes to a super reverb. He has a very distinctive jangly tone, which he became famous for in the Smiths, before he'd even discovered the Jaguar and was using Rickenbackers among other guitars. This, I think, is why the other guitarist in his current band, James Doviak, who plays mostly a Yamaha SG-1000, through a multi-effects unit into what looks like a Marshall Plexi. That's the reason he can often imitate the jangle tone that Marr is famous for. The guitar and amp are different, but the modulation devices between them can make that difference harder to perceive. And this is why even very experienced guitarists will sometimes express uncertainty if you ask them what guitar is being played in a particular recording. There are just too many variables to be sure. Guitar model, tone control settings, pedals, most of which have their own settings, amp model, and EQ settings. We're a long way from the basic rig that the first amp and electric guitar designers were trying to optimize. We need to distinguish, though, between the differences in rig that the guitarist can feel and hear, as distinct from the ones that an audience can feel and hear. Between, that is, audible and tactile differences. Guitarists can do both of these, but audiences mostly hear the sound, but can also in very subtle ways feel the sound through their bodies. Guitarists do both of these, but additionally and crucially, they can feel the guitar in their hands. They know that adjusting amp settings via pedals is often more convenient than changing the amp settings by hand. Neil Young's amp technicians, Sal Trentino and Rick Davis, designed an interesting variation on this. Neil Young's got a big red floorboard, which you can see in front of him at virtually every gig. It's known as the Whizzer, and by means of four foot switches on it, it physically turns the knobs on his main amp, which is a 1959 Fender Deluxe. This gives him, in effect, 4 gain stages, but they all do depend on the individual character of his amp. You could say that they are organic. So to sum up, most of the big innovations in guitar and amp technology were based on the assumption that the guitarist had just 2 things to vary tone with, a guitar and an amp. The current situation is extremely different. Guitars and amps have become available in more affordable forms, often almost indistinguishable from the more expensive forms, as in the case, for example, of the Standard and Professional series, the new series, of the current Yamaha Revstars. We can, as guitarists, be seduced to buy this slightly cheaper gear, supposing we have the money at all, and land ourselves in a world of complexity before we've got much understanding of the essentials. My first good guitar was an acoustic, a Yamaha FG-180. It was equivalent in reputation at the time to something like a Yamaha LL16 now. It had no onboard electronics. I didn't know what they were. I didn't understand the subtleties of tone wood, fretboard radius and material, fret height, nut width, scale length, neck shape, string composition and gauge, and so on. I just got on with learning and busking the subways around Marble Arch in London. As it happens, the FG 180 is a fantastic guitar. I'd never part with mine willingly, any more than my first Strat. But because I didn't for ages know about setups, my guitar wasn't optimized. It had quite high action, and this, combined with a chunky neck, were a challenge to someone with small hands. Before the Yami, I'd had a no-name Spanish guitar and was surprised by how different steel strings felt. But I persevered, undistracted by guitar mags or YouTube. I'm grateful now to know about the full range of gear available, and I take real delight in learning about it and occasionally in getting something new. But as regards the electric guitar, a lot of the heavily commercialized discussion about tone implies that with a complex modern rig, all the elements in it will be audible. In practice, they're unlikely to be, not unless you insist on learning how the guitar sounds when it's plugged straight into one particular amp. And this is the delusion that we need to work our way out of. Why? Well, so that we can get on with the business of making music and enjoying it. Thanks very much. See you next time.